Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
Tracy, did you know that I'm kind of obsessed with popcorn?
No, I did not know this.
I love popcorn.
I love it too.
Like, I love it. We can talk about it behind the scenes.
Yeah, let's do.
Lately, on and off the last couple of years, I've been looking at whether or not I should buy a glazing machine to do
fancy ones.
Theme park style popcorn.
Fun.
I always back off of it in a moment of like, you don't need that. Part of it is because there's only one person in my house that eats popcorn. But the bottom line is that this and a couple other things have made me think about like popcorn. And we'll talk about it in the course of the episode. But a lot of like what we know about popcorn's early phases, or what gets repeated a lot, is flat out false.
Right.
So at least in modern culture. So I thought it would be fun to pick apart popcorn through the ages, because it goes back very far, but was not necessarily as prevalent in places we have been told it was. And then we'll talk about how it has become a huge industry.
Yeah.
I had not thought about the economics of why it is such a profit industry, but now I have. So we'll talk about all of that today.
Yeah. So the use of the word corn in historical contexts, at least some of the time, it can be a little deceiving because corn is a word that has historically been used more generally to describe all kinds of grain crops. So today, corn. I want to say the big lump with knobs, but that's from so long ago on the internet. It's already a very dated reference. Just the thing, with ears. But corn, in translation of the Bible as having been in Egypt, that was probably barley. Similarly, in Britain, the word corn has been used to refer to crops that could include both wheat and oats. So if you're reading really old historical documents and there's a reference to corn, it might not mean the relative of grass specifically that we call corn today.
Yes, because corn is grass.
Corn is grass. As for another reference that
the cut's a little deep, but it's fine. I feel like many of our listeners will get it. The corn that we think of today using that word is a native plant species to the Americas that, as Tracy said, related to grass. And popping corn is a specific type of maize, which is different from the corn you would eat, of course, as corn on the cob or in corn dishes where you eat the intact kernel. Popping corn has a husk that is 4 times thicker than those other varieties, and popcorn predates the other corn types, although they are all the same species. So you could have flour corn, pod corn, sweet corn, dent corn, and flint corn. They're all very close genetic matches to popcorn, but slightly different, that were developed over time as crops for their edibility. And according to Andrew Smith in his 1999 book, Popped Culture, quote, by the time Europeans encountered the New World in the late 15th century, maize was already a domesticated plant that did not grow in the wild. Without human cultivation, maize did not survive.
Yeah, so just to recap, maize, one of the many, many plants native to the Americas, cultivated by indigenous people, now enjoyed worldwide.
Yes.
The science of how corn pops, really pretty simple. That thick wall of the kernel encases a little pocket of starch and moisture. And when the corn is heated up, that moisture inside causes the starch to liquefy. Just as boiling water expands, so does that liquefied starch, and it builds up enough pressure to break that outer shell, rapidly expanding and re-solidifying into the fluffy white popcorn that we're familiar with. Today, when popcorn is grown, every step of the process is designed to ensure that you get that fluffy popped finish. It is cured on the stalk and then dried until it reaches 14% moisture.
For a long time, the oldest example of popcorn ever found was estimated to be 4,000 years old. And these are small ears that were found in the Bat Cave of Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And we say these are small ears. We're talking about 2 inches long is the largest of the collected specimens. The smallest was reported as smaller than a penny. Even today, if you grow popcorn, those ears are smaller than the other kinds of corn we've talked about, but not quite this tiny. So, in any case, very dissimilar from the ears of corn that you might see today. But then in 2010, far older samples of popcorn were found in Peru. And these were dated to 6,700 years ago. And they're really interesting because in that case, the popcorn appears to have been popped while still on the cob, not from separated kernels.
Dolores Paperno, who at the time was curator of New World Archaeology at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., co-authored a paper on these samples that was published in 2012. It was titled Pre-Ceramic Maize from Peredones and Huaca Prieta, Peru. One interesting conclusion in this paper was the statement, quote, given the scarcity and discontinuous stratigraphic presence of maize, macrofossils, and microfossils at Peredones and Huaca Prieta, and at other pre-ceramic sites in the region, we infer that this crop, both its popcorn and floury forms, was not a primary food staple in the local diet before about 4,500 to 4,200 cal BP. So just in case folks aren't familiar with that terminology, BP is before the present, and cal BP is calibrated before the present.
Yeah, that's type of year dating that you'll see used in a lot of archaeological papers. But although popcorn wasn't, according to that paper, a particularly major part of the agriculture of Peru, it is now believed that popcorn was being actively cultivated by people of the Americas in other places as far back as 9,000 years ago. Paperno gave a statement in the press when this whole article was published and became very popular for a minute that it was cultivated from a wild grass known as teosinte. People that couldn't grow it likely traded for it. This earlier version of popcorn was also likely closer to what's called parched corn today. So in some cases, it wasn't popping exactly, but it was being used in a way that it was dry heated so it would puff up slightly and become like a crunchy thing.
The Aztec culture is often invoked in popcorn discussion, and for good reason. Popcorn was used as food and also as part of ceremonial practices. When Conquistador Hernan Cortez first came in contact with the Aztecs, which, as we know, would ultimately lead to the culture's destruction, he became the first European to see popcorn and noted its use for eating, as well as being strung on garlands that were used as jewelry and headdresses and as decoration. The onomatopoetic word used by the Aztecs to represent the sound of the corn popping was totopoca.
Popcorn was also closely associated with the Aztec rain god Toscatl. A Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún, who traveled to the Americas in the 1520s to convert the indigenous people there, wrote of popcorn, quote, they scattered parched corn called momajital, a kind of corn which bursts when parched and discloses its contents and makes itself look like a very white flour. They said these were hailstones given to the god of water. Now that's an interesting quote because some translations of Sahagún's words in this passage omit that whole reference to the god of water, so it's not sure if a translator added it later. Some translations describe the corn grains instead as simply being like scattered dice, and there's no mention of a deity. Sahagún made the effort to learn and understand the Nahua language that he encountered and to work with members of the Aztec culture in gathering information for his book, General History of the Things of New Spain.
Jesuit missionary Bernabe Cobo, who visited Peru in the early 1600s, also wrote of the practice of eating popcorn there. Quote, they toast a certain kind of corn until it bursts. That corn, which was used in confection, was called pisancaya. The Spanish naturalist Felix de Azara described a grain he encountered in the Americas in the late 1700s this way, quote, "It is boiled in fat or oil. The grains burst without becoming detached, and there results a superb bouquet fit to adorn a lady's hair at night without anyone knowing what it was. I have often eaten these burst grains and found them very good."
So that's obviously an example of them being popped on the cob. One of the reasons that popcorn became a staple in so many American cultures over time is its longevity. Unpopped kernels or dried cobs of them keep for a very, very long time, so they can travel and store really easily. As evidence of that longevity, botanist Thomas Harper Goodspeed, founder of the botanical gardens at University of California, was given a gift by a colleague from Chile in the late 1930s. It was pre-Inca popcorn. And Goodspeed's curiosity about them eventually got the better of him, and he tried popping them. In 1941, he published a book titled Plant Hunters in the Andes, and he shared the results, writing, quote, "One evening at home in Berkeley, it occurred to me to try an experiment with my kernels of pre-Inca popcorn. I placed a few on a pie tin and heated them on the electric stove. Much to my surprise, that corn, which had been gathered nearly 1,000 years ago, popped as readily as did last year's crop that had come in a box from the shelves of the neighborhood cash and carry store."
I'm curious how he knew that it was pre-Inca popcorn and
Right,
not.
he's taking that person's word for it, that
Yeah,
it's
okay. I had questions. And of course, these travelers from Europe brought maize back home with them. Spain and Italy were the first places it was introduced, and then it made its way to Turkey. But for a long time, it was used to feed animals and not humans. There were very few instances of anyone in Europe trying to pop it when it got to Asia. Also, through Spanish colonists, it was adopted more readily as a food for people, including in its popped form.
Yeah, I saw one mention of, like, this one place in Romania that there may be evidence that it had been popped at one point. And, of course, obviously, people eventually did adopt maize and maize products into their stuff. That's why we have things like polenta, but not really into it initially. While you have probably heard that popcorn was served at the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth Colony, that's baloney. There is no evidence to support that claim.
There's a lot about the first Thanksgiving story that there's.
There are, and specifically the idea of indigenous people giving colonists popcorn comes up in so much literature. That book I mentioned just a moment ago, goes through like this long list from like everyone from like Jane Addams writing about it to I think Thoreau at one point, like all of these people that perpetuated this myth and made it part of that like kind of fuzzy, more lovable story of how those encounters worked. And it's like there's literally nothing to support this. But there was some mention of popcorn from colonists in the mid-1600s. John Winthrop Jr. made a report to the Royal Society of London in 1662 that included popping corn in his description of the ways that Native Americans used maize, noting that they seemed to turn inside out and become flour-like. But he also described the resulting puffs not being eaten as they were the way we think of popcorn, but being ground after that or beaten into a meal. 100 years later, Ben Franklin described a similar process, with the popping being done in a large iron pot with sand, and then the sand being sifted off before the pounding into the meal step. But popcorn among the indigenous people of the East Coast of North America doesn't really appear to have been a very big thing. It was more work to grow and harder to use than other forms of maize, so it kind of seems like it really didn't get a lot of favor.
Coming up, we'll talk about reasons it's tricky to figure out exactly how popcorn got a start in the United States as a nation, different from the Americas as a region. We'll take a quick sponsor break before we get to that.
Because Because popcorn is inexpensive and, as we've said, long-lasting, it became somewhat of a novelty to a lot of folks in the early United States once it had formed as a country. Although there isn't actually a mention of actual popcorn in writing until the 1830s, when it was mentioned in a periodical called Cultivator, which was geared towards farmers. According to Andrew Smith in Pop Culture, it's possible that in terms of European descendant inhabitants of the U.S. in the 1800s, the practice of popping corn might have even come from Africa. As maize made its way across Europe in the 1500s, it also moved south into Africa. But this is purely a theory. The way maize spread, which was in some cases tied to the slave trade, makes it actually pretty hard to know who actually had it and who brought the concept of popcorn into the culture of the U.S. And of course, there was popcorn in South America well before any of this, so it may have just moved north. But there's no real chain of evidence to clearly identify how white men started popping popcorn rather than parching and grinding it.
The ways people popped popcorn and its early adoption in the United States could vary a lot. Some sound kind of arduous. There was a way similar to how it would be done today by a lot of folks using fat or oil in a kettle. Another method was to toss kernels of popping corn into the hot ashes from a fire, and then give that kind of a stir to get the kernels to pop. That meant that you had to get the popped kernels out from the ash to eat it. And I'm just not seeing how you don't wind up with a mouthful of ash.
Yeah, that's a hard pass for me.
Another approach was a wire box method, where kernels could be placed in a wire container that was held over a fire.
Though it may have taken a while to catch on, once popcorn was introduced to the U.S. in its fluffy form, it kind of became a fad. Just a decade after that reference in Cultivator, the word popcorn appeared in Bartlett's Dictionary of Americanism. So over a 10-year period, it had gotten really, really popular. Soon, holidays celebrated in the U.S. started to have popcorn associated with them. And kind of all holidays, right? Like, we sometimes think of popcorn garlands for Christmas. I don't think a lot of people do that, but some still do. Or like popcorn balls at Halloween. But it also became part of Easter traditions, just popcorn not in its candied form as Halloween traditions. And this eventually led to the development of the popcorn ball that I just mentioned. So a mass of popcorn held together by a sugar coating. These were not only eaten as a treat, but they were also used as decor in some cases. You could even buy molds and gadgets that would help shape candy-coated popcorn into decorative shapes so you could make a little ornament. By the 1860s, popcorn recipes started appearing in cookbooks. They often included ways to make sweet treats or desserts with it. It wasn't so much savory stuff going on at that point.
When the steel plow was invented in the mid-1800s, that made growing popcorn even easier, and the crop became even more popular. It became easier to cut the stalks, which were really sturdy. This is what led to the development of the Corn Belt. It was during the latter half of the 1800s that popcorn was also adopted by healthy living advocates. Dietitian Ella Kellogg, the wife of John Harvey Kellogg, used popcorn as a breakfast cereal, eating it with milk. She thought popcorn should be incorporated as a dish at just about any meal. At that point, popcorn was readily available in just about every grocery, and it was also routinely sold as a treat at sporting events and circuses.
In 1875, Frederick J. Myers of Govington, Kentucky, filed a patent for a corn popper that enabled the user to keep from burning their hand. The handle of the device stayed cool to the touch. His improvement in corn poppers didn't involve any kind of revolutionary materials or thermodynamic tricks. You could just detach the handle while the corn was over the heat source and then reattach it to pull the popped corn out.
10 years after Myers' patent, Charles Creeders enters the story, and he's a significant figure in popcorn's U.S. history. Creeders owned a candy store, and as he sought to expand his offerings, he ordered a peanut roaster for his shop so he could sell fresh roasted nuts alongside his candy. He didn't actually like the roaster, though, and started taking it apart to see if he could improve on it. Somehow, in the tinkering, Creeders expanded his vision to invent a new roaster instead of just trying to fix the one he'd purchased and didn't like. Around the same time, he realized he could design a machine that would pop popcorn as well as roast peanuts, and that he could use it to roast coffee beans as well. He ended up building roasters in a variety of sizes to fit different needs. Creeders used steam to run his machinery, which gave consistent power. And in the case of the popcorn, that meant it would heat evenly and produce consistent batches of white, fluffy popcorn. He popped that in a mixture of lard and clarified butter. The steam was then used to keep the popped popcorn warm. He was able to add seasonings before popping, and that would stick to the kernels as they exploded. Soon he was selling roasting machines to other entrepreneurs instead of selling candy.
In 1893, Creeders exhibited at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Popular Mechanics reported on the popcorn machine on wheels that he had on display, which was marketed to grocery stores initially as something that they could move in or out of the building as proprietors wished. According to that write-up in Popular Mechanics, quote, this machine was designed with the idea of moving it about to any location where the operator would be likely to do a good business. The apparatus, which is light and strong and weighing but 400 or 500 pounds, can be drawn readily by a boy or by a small pony to any picnic ground, fair, political rally, etc., and to many other places where a good business could be done for a day or two. After kind of a slow start at the expo where he couldn't get people interested, Creeders just started making bags of popcorn to give away. And then that freebie plus the smell of popcorn popping made the crowd show up. He eventually started selling the popcorn, and he made a nice sum over the course of the exposition. And the success of his popcorn sales also inspired the sales of his mobile popcorn machine, which he called the Earn More. And this launched an entirely new field of mobile food vending. While people have sold food on foot for centuries, we've talked about it so many times, this was new in that the food could be prepared on the spot wherever the vendor went. Other manufacturers of nut roasting machines hustled to get in on this new popcorn market by making poppers similar to Creeders. The Creeders Company, by the way, still exists today, and it still manufactures concession equipment of all kinds.
As Creeders was working on his popping machine, commercially produced popcorn became available at retail. Up until the 1880s, people who made popcorn were usually growing their own or getting it in places like farmers markets. But in the 1880s, the Albert Dickinson Company started offering prepackaged popcorn with the branding names of Big Buster and Little Buster.
Similarly, other people besides Creeders were working to innovate in the corn popping arena. One of Creeders' employees, C.F. Dunbar, left the company to start his own popcorn machine business, and he invented a machine that would pop the popcorn dry without any oil and then pass it through an automated butter dispenser. The first patent for a machine that would coat popcorn with a sugar glaze to keep each popped kernel fresh was filed by a man named James Voods. This machine kept those pop kernels separate from one another so each one could dry with the coating without clumping up into a ball.
Frederick and Louis Ruckheim of Germany developed a handheld popper that gave them the capability to flavor each small batch however they wished. The Ruckheims are also responsible for introducing an enduring snack brand, which is Cracker Jack. Cracker Jack, in case anybody in our listening audience has not had it, combines popcorn and peanuts with a molasses coating. Cracker Jack was such a huge hit that copycat recipes started showing up in cookbooks not long after its introduction.
Once again, because of the low cost, popcorn has endured in popularity through various economic downturns. During the Great Depression, popcorn became one of the few treats that families could still afford. It was kind of an austerity luxury. And it also meant that companies that sold popcorn fared better during the Great Depression than other industries as popcorn sales continued to rise.
The Depression also led to one of the most common associations we have with popcorn, and that's being a movie theater snack. This was a cost-effective way for theater owners to offer some kind of snack. That overhead was very low, but not all theaters were on board with the popcorn boom initially. Some of them feared, rightfully, as anybody who has ever left a theater at the end of a movie has seen, that it would make messes. Sometimes people intentionally make bigger messes with it. There had also just been a push within the industry to create a luxury experience that popcorn and other snacks couldn't really match with. But it was so popular already as a low-cost snack that popcorn sellers started to pop up adjacent to theaters, having moved there from sporting events and carnivals. So patrons could buy a bag on their way into the theater. Eventually, theater owners recognized that they were losing a potential revenue stream and started offering popcorn in their establishments. In many theaters, this began as a rental arrangement with the vendors who had once been outside. But over time, theaters introduced their own snack counters and handled their own concessions. And of course, most won't let you bring a whole bag of popcorn in with you.
Unless you're really sly, and then they
You're
still don't want you
sneaky.
to do it. But, I'm not going to comment on that. Anyway, another world event that further solidified popcorn's hold on the U.S. snack market was World War II. Sugar was rationed in World War II. It was one of the first things to be rationed. The supply lines that the continental U.S. got sugar through were the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, all of which were theaters of war. So those supply lines were essentially cut. Additionally, what sugar there was often sent overseas for troops. The amount of sugar allowed through rationing was half of what most households used on average. Because of the sugar shortage, savory popcorn once again had a surge of popularity as a snack that was readily available and could be eaten without sugar. Reportedly, popcorn consumption in the U.S. tripled in the early 1940s.
Coming up, we'll talk about how the invention of television caused popcorn's popularity to dip for a little bit. But first, we will hear from some sponsors that keep the show going.
Okay, we will finally get to an important historical moment that actually hurt popcorn sales, at least for a little while, and that's the advent of television. As people adopted the new technology at home, they made big use of it as an entertainment investment. And as a consequence, movie theaters saw a drop in ticket sales, and thus popcorn sales also declined. At this point, in this moment, popcorn was usually, though not always, a treat that people would eat when they went out. People absolutely did continue to make popcorn at home, but that was no longer the primary way that most popcorn was consumed. But that shift to home entertainment brought about by the rise of television shifted things once again for popcorn too, because then, after a while, they missed that popcorn and it became more and more common again for families to make popcorn themselves at home to eat while watching TV.
Another icon of popcorn's popularity in the U.S. was Orville Redenbacher. Redenbacher was born in Brazil, Indiana on July 16th, 1907. His parents were corn farmers, and Orville grew up to work as a Farm Bureau extension agent after graduating from Purdue University with a degree in agronomy. He also opened his own very successful fertilizer company, but popcorn had always been his favorite treat, and he had dabbled for years with the idea of creating a perfect popping corn.
By the early 1970s, Redenbacher was ready to turn that hobby into a business. He had developed a strain of corn that he felt was absolutely perfect for popping, and he partnered with a man named Charlie Bowman to launch a company to sell it. And the popcorn was originally named as a portmanteau of the two men's names. It was called Redbow. But by the time they started selling it, it was Orville Redenbacher Popcorn. That's a name change that he said was based on advice from an advertising firm. There's a very funny David Letterman clip of him explaining this thing if you ever want to go hunting for it online. It was a very small company to start. Orville initially was selling the popcorn out of his car.
But in 1972, there was a huge ad campaign. Orville starred in the commercials right alongside his popcorn, and soon he became really well recognized. Although he was so associated with the commercials that a lot of people thought he was an actor portraying the character of Orville Redenbacher, not like actually the man that the product was named for. Regardless of whether consumers understood the importance of the company's commercial spokesman, Orville Redenbacher popcorn became a huge seller.
And then there was, of course, The microwave oven. So, the microwave, which we talked about before, was the brainchild of Percy Spencer, who worked for Raytheon Manufacturing Corporation, which produced or reported 80% of the magnetrons used by the Allied forces in World War II. In a meeting where the executives of Raytheon were trying to come up with ways to keep the company's momentum going in peacetime, Spencer suggested that magnetrons might be used to cook food. And Spencer was really well respected. His work had been what enabled Raytheon to produce magnetrons at the scale needed to support the war effort. So they took his idea to heart and started experimenting with food. We've talked before about Spencer and that great story about how he realized that microwaves could heat food when a candy bar in his pocket melted while he was working in the lab one day.
Building on that food lore, popcorn didn't just benefit from the transition of microwave technology into home use, it was also an important part of developing it. Percy Spencer used popcorn to test what would happen to it when it was exposed to the magnetron after this whole melting candy bar incident. He's said to have ended up with popped kernels flying all over the lab.
Although the development of the microwave began in the 1940s, it didn't really become widely appealing to home consumers for several decades. But once that new technology was integrated into a lot of people's household lives, manufacturers sought ways to capitalize on it, and they started developing popcorn specifically designed for microwave use. And microwave popcorn is one of those oddities that was embraced by consumers really quickly. Microwave popcorn got a boost from the huge surge in fitness enthusiasm in the 1980s. It's a pretty healthy treat. It has a low calorie and sodium count, and it offers a lot of fiber. So, just as more and more households were getting microwaves, a large portion of those households were interested in popcorn, whether it was just because it's an easy, tasty treat or because they saw it as healthier than other options.
I will say that sodium number can really vary depending
Well,
on how
popcorn
it's
on its
seasoned.
own
Right.
has very little sodium.
Very little. But if it's covered in salty butter
But if
with
you're
additional
me,
salt.
that changes.
In a 1987 article in the New York Times titled Microwave Key to Popcorn War, it was noted that, quote, 5 years ago, microwave popcorn did not exist. In 1983, the first full year that microwave popcorn was available nationally, it generated retail sales of $53 million, according to Packaged Facts, a New York-based consumer research concern. Last year, consumers popped an estimated $250 million worth of the stuff, according to the Popcorn Institute, a Chicago-based trade group.
Yeah, that's huge growth over a 5-year period. That article also noted that Orville Redenbacher, who at that point was the undisputed king of home use popcorn brands for more than a decade, was suddenly in competition with companies like Pillsbury, General Mills, and Nabisco, which had all launched their own microwave popcorn products. The article then quoted then GM of General Mills, Donald Knutson, as saying of their microwave popcorn pop secret, quote, "This is easily the hottest microwave product General Mills has ever introduced." The article also mentions cost and that even though microwave popcorn costs more than twice as much as regular popcorn, consumers seem to be happy to pay that for the convenience. But we should note that though Redenbacher had competition, and that was the whole crux of this article, that brand, which was owned by the Beatrice Company in 1987, had been selling microwave popcorn since 1983, and it was still the leading brand on the market. When Orville Redenbacher died in 1995, his popcorn accounted for 45% of the market.
Citing market experts, that article also predicted that a few brands would survive and thrive, but all other microwave popcorn makers would fall away. This was way off base, given the situation at most grocery stores these days, where there are dozens of options for microwave popcorn and many other products. Also way off base was a quote from Deborah A. Coombe, who was manager of popcorn popper manufacturer West Bend Company. According to her, quote, "Microwave popcorn is a fad. It will last until people read labels and realize what chemicals microwave manufacturers put into their popcorn." Microwave popcorn did lose some market share to pre-popped popcorn in the early 2010s.
But it's still around. It's not a fad. Popcorn is, in fact, such an enduring treat that it enabled some movie theaters to stay afloat even when no movies were showing during the early days of the pandemic. In a May 2023 write up at Serious Eats, the co owner of a theater in Park Ridge, Illinois, named Dave Lumos, talked about his company's use of popcorn to maintain business. He said, quote, "We had our doors closed and no income coming in. We decided to do curbside popcorn pickup to see how it would go, and we've been doing that for the past couple of weeks, and it seems like it's well received."
That's very smart, in my opinion.
I think so too.
Popcorn once again had a huge surge when the COVID-19 pandemic began because people wanted to replicate movie night at home. Grocery store popcorn sales rose a reported 30%. In 2021, the global popcorn market was estimated to be worth $5.2 billion. It's expected to continue on a growth trajectory into 2030. One of the largest drivers today is the ready-to-eat popcorn market, and particularly gourmet flavors of pre-popped popcorn.
Oh, popcorn, I love you.
Mm-hmm.
Aw. I will talk in behind the scenes on Friday about popcorn
Yeah,
ad
we super
nauseum.
will. I'm excited.
Popcorn! I have a listener mail from our listener, Trenna. Trenna writes, "Hi, Tracy and Holly. First, of course, I am a longtime listener and fan, but first-time emailer. I love the podcast and often listen when I'm driving for a number of hours, so I get both episodes and the behind-the-scenes all in one swoop. I'm finally writing because it seems that all of the stars aligned to compel me to say how thankful I am for your podcast. As a history major, I loved hearing the behind the scenes, so to speak, regarding the famous people of our past. So just after listening to your episode on Vinnie Ream, I went to Washington, D.C. for a friend's birthday. I really wanted to see the statue, but unfortunately, all of the tours of the Capitol building were sold out. Instead, I spent many an hour touring all of the monuments and tributes, including Washington Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, World War I and II memorials, Korean War Memorial, Vietnam Memorial, African American History Museum, which is an amazing museum if you've never been. That's my input. Harriet Tubman Museum in Cambridge, and many more places. My last tour that I crammed in that day, I was leaving, but I could not leave without seeing Arlington. I took a 2-hour walking tour that included JFK Memorial and his brothers and Justice Ginsburg, Thurgood Marshall, and many more. I was disappointed to not see Vinnie's statue, but our tour guide pointed out a gravesite and asked anyone if they knew who they were. It was Jimmy Doolittle. And I was like, Horshack, dating myself here, because of course I listened to the episode. I took a picture of the tomb to include in this email just to send you. Thank you so much for what you do. I love listening to the funny parts of the story and how you both crack up at the sillier side of things. So to that end, my poor old kitty died last year after a very long life, so I'm including a picture of another funny episode from my past. Background, my husband and I had 2 dogs who were BFFs forever. When the older one, Mac, died, my poor little miniature dachshund was heartbroken, following me everywhere. So I had the bright idea of adopting another dachshund to keep him company. I found a rescue on a website and thought she was adorable. We went out to meet her with Winston to see if they were compatible. They appeared to get along well, so I said, we will take her. At which point the rescue center told me about her mother. Apparently, the 2 were living in a car with a bunch of other dogs, and they were all rescued, and no one had come forward for the mother, who she had been with her whole life. Yep, you guessed it. I'm a sucker, so I said, give me the mom, too. I love you for this. Well, 2 weeks later, I'm sitting on our sofa, and the younger one goes crazy, running all over and up and down the stairs, pulling down the Afghans and blankets, and I didn't know what to think. About 30 minutes later, I hear a mewling noise. I got up to look, and yes, you guessed it, there was a puppy on the couch. I called to my husband, calmly, I'm sure, honey, we have a problem. After back and forth about, yes, really, there is a puppy on our couch, he dove in and helped deliver the rest of the pups. Of course, it was a Sunday, so no vets were open. In the end, we navigated the delivery of 3 puppies. Within 2 days, one of my best friends came over and said how cute the puppies were. Then she looked at the mom and said, I'll have one of hers. I said, she's not pregnant. And my friend said, yes, she is. Sure enough, my husband took mom to the vet the next day, and 4 puppies were in our future. So long story short, we went from 1 dog to 10 dogs in about a month. Here's a picture of my miniature dachshund with the puppies. Who doesn't love a snuggle? Looking forward to seeing you in Indianapolis, Trenna. One, I love you for taking care of all of these bibis. Two, I love you for adopting a mom. That's always my thing on Mother's Day.
Mhm.
Adopt the mom animals. They don't get taken in, the puppies and kittens always do, and they often sit in
Yeah.
shelters. So hooray for you. Thank you for that. And also, I have been at a puppy delivery and it's a lot of work, and like my hat is off to you. So thank you so much for accidentally segueing us to being able to talk about our live show in Indiana. We're going
Yeah.
to be at the Indiana Historical Society on July 19th. So if you would like to see Stuff You Missed in History class live, it is a 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. show at the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana History Center. It is $30. If you're a member, it's $20. If you're only going to the show, there's another option for a slightly more expensive ticket, which also includes a meet and greet. So we would love to see you there. If you would like to register for this show and come and see us in Indianapolis, we would love to see you. You can do that at www.indianahistory.org/events. And you'll see it right there. And we will be there. And Trenna, I will hug you for taking care of all of those dogs. Because thank you for doing it. They're so cute. This is also the wonderful mystery and surprise sometimes of adopting rescue animals from shelters. Different shelters have different levels of care they're able to give before adoption. Sometimes you get a surprise.
One of my previous cats, who is no longer with me, was the mom, and they had found homes for all the babies. And then Villanelle came to live with me for the next decade-ish, more than that.
She was a cute little shy thing.
Yeah.
So thank you. If you want to write to us about your adventures in touring historical sites or with animals and surprise puppies, which I'm just gazing at this puppy picture. It's like a dopamine hit. It's so good. Or anything else you want to talk about, you can write to us at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also find us on social media as Missed in History. And if you would like to subscribe to the podcast and you haven't, you can do that on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.